Geopolitics, understood in its most unvarnished dimension, is the art of provoking a crisis and then leaving one's allies to absorb the consequences. The man who throws the stone and hides the hand is not a literary figure. It is a precise description of how certain powers have managed their regional commitments in the Persian Gulf over recent years. And on April 22nd of this year, Iran warned, with a precision that admits no ambiguity and no charitable interpretation, that it is prepared to invade the United Arab Emirates by land if the United States launches a ground assault on Iranian soil. Forewarned is forearmed. That is the ancient formula. And in foreign policy, ancient formulas have a stubborn tendency to be fulfilled. Before I continue, I want to ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you have not already done so. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an analysis. And wherever you are watching from, whether you are in the United States, Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, tell me in the comments what city and country you are writing from, because I am genuinely interested in knowing from which corner of the world these crucial questions are being asked. If you find this content useful, please share this video with those around you and give it a like. That helps us reach more people who deserve to hear an honest analysis, without concessions to convenient narratives, and without the euphemisms that so abundantly populate mainstream media coverage of these events. Very well. Let us return to the thread of what has happened, because the layers of this crisis are numerous, and each one deserves the careful attention that newspaper headlines rarely provide. The escalation scenario I am describing was published by the Fars news agency, a media outlet linked directly to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And the most alarming aspect of all this is not the threat itself, but rather that Iran has the genuine capacity to carry it out. This is not empty rhetoric. This is not the bluster of an isolated regime resorting to verbal provocation because it lacks real instruments of power. We are talking about a region where tensions between the United States and Iran had been simmering for a very long time, accumulating pressure beneath the surface of diplomatic communiques and facade agreements that no one in Washington seemed to take particularly seriously. I have spent decades studying how liberal democracies manage, or more frequently mismanage, their commitments abroad. And what I observe here is a pattern I recognize with uncomfortable familiarity: the illusion that technological superiority and conventional military power can substitute for strategy, for deep knowledge of the adversary, and for diplomatic patience. That illusion carries a cost. And that cost is unfolding right now in the Persian Gulf with a speed that should alarm any serious observer of international affairs. Since February 28th, the date on which this military offensive began, the regional chessboard changed in an irreversible manner. And it must be said plainly, even if it discomforts those who prefer the simpler narrative, this was an unprovoked war. Prior to that date, there was no Iranian aggression of any kind that could have justified the military response that was unleashed. The United States and Israel decided on their own account, and without consulting the rest of their Gulf allies, to initiate that war. They gave no advance warning. They built no regional or international consensus. They presented no case before any multilateral forum. They simply acted, driven by a combination of strategic calculation and political impatience. And now the rest of the world, especially the closest allies in the region, is paying the price of that unilateral decision. From that moment, Washington extended one ceasefire, then another. It began watching as its military bases, radars, aircraft carriers, and planes were systematically destroyed or damaged, and at the same time, it maintains a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. Since April 13th of this year, we have had nearly 2 weeks of blockade against Iranian ports. It is a posture that attempts to blend maximum pressure with a will toward resolution that until now has produced no concrete result on the ground. Parallel to all of this, the Fars agency detailed something very concrete that merits our full attention. If the United States sets even a single foot on Iranian soil, the response will not remain within Iran's borders. The response will be a ground invasion against 2 countries, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Both are strategic allies of Washington. Both are geographically vulnerable, and both represent, from the Iranian perspective, the most accessible pressure point for inflicting an immediate, devastating, and perfectly calibrated cost. This is worth underscoring with all the precision it deserves. We are not talking about airstrikes or cyber operations. We are talking about troops moving overland, crossing sovereign borders. That is an entirely different order of magnitude. It transcends even the plane of conventional symmetric warfare to become a threat with first-order geopolitical and economic consequences, implications for international law, for collective defense treaties, and for the stability of the global financial system, which depends in substantial measure on the uninterrupted flow of energy from this region. And in that same April 22nd warning, Iran went even further. If key infrastructure within its territory is destroyed, the response will include attacks on oil and electricity installations across all of America's allied Gulf states. An eye for an eye. Iran understands that Washington is far beyond its direct reach, but its regional allies are close at hand. What was struck in February would now be done systematically, with very specific rules and a list of targets already published without ambiguity and without need of decipherment. During the February attacks, we already saw the first effects of this logic of proportional reprisal. Dubai had to close its airspace. International flights were suspended for days. Thousands of travelers were stranded at the airport, unable to depart or arrive. At least 12 deaths were officially acknowledged, with reasonable suspicion that the Emirates did not disclose the full figure. What Iran is now describing is the expanded, systematized, and structurally deeper version of that same scenario. We must understand clearly what Iran is doing from a strategic standpoint, because a superficial reading of this situation invariably leads to mistaken conclusions. Iran is not issuing a threat to be heard. It is issuing a threat to be believed. The message is no longer directed solely at Washington. It is directed at the governments of the Emirates and Bahrain, which are strategic allies of the United States, but also depend on international investors, tourists from around the world, and the global financial flows that sustain their particular economic model. Who in their right mind would book a flight to Dubai today with this warning in effect? Only someone who does not read the news with the attention it deserves. I have observed that some travelers are going precisely because prices have dropped dramatically. That is understandable from the logic of the individual consumer seeking a market opportunity, but it reflects a troubling disconnect between the perception of risk and geopolitical reality. The Iranian warning is seeking precisely that deterrent effect, draining Washington's regional allies of tourists, investors, and confidence without needing to fire a single additional missile in this phase. It is a move of calculated coldness that we can only acknowledge for its strategic efficiency. What Iran is saying is, if you strike me, I do not merely bleed you, I bleed the entire region, and it says so, with the credibility earned by the actions already taken in February, which demonstrated that these were not empty threats or diplomatic posturing. On April 22nd, another parallel threat emerged that has received far less attention than it deserves in the Western media. Outlets linked to Iran's revolutionary forces published maps of submarine internet cables in the Persian Gulf. Maps that identify with disturbing precision that the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia depend on those cables critically for their entire digital infrastructure, far more so than Iran itself. The implicit message requires no translation. I know exactly where these cables run. You want to leave me without power. I will leave you without internet. And the problem does not end there. Iran has the technical and operational capacity to follow through on that threat if things escalate further, and the current dynamics suggest with unsettling clarity that this possibility is real and not merely theoretical. The rules of the game Iran published on April 22nd are as follows. First, any ground attack by the United States converts Bahrain and the Emirates into the primary targets of a ground invasion. Second, if Iran suffers damage to its critical infrastructure, the entire region will be left without internet, without oil, without electricity, and very probably without potable water. And that last point deserves an explanation that is rarely given with sufficient clarity. Among Iran's declared targets are desalination plants. For those who do not fully understand the importance of a desalination plant in this part of the world, allow me to explain it with the precision the matter deserves. In the countries of the Persian Gulf, there is not enough natural fresh water to sustain the populations that inhabit them today. The only way to make those cities habitable in the middle of the desert is by purifying salt water, removing the salt to convert it into water fit for human consumption. If those plants cease to function, people die of thirst, not in a metaphorical or exaggerated sense, in a strictly literal sense. The third element of the announced escalation encompasses targeted assassinations as a category with its own specific response already officially declared. And to this must be added what Iran has been systematically warning since March. If American troops set foot on Iranian soil, 5 specific installations in the United Arab Emirates will be attacked. Among those installations is the Baraka nuclear power plant in Abu Dhabi. Iran has published maps with the concrete targets. The Jebel Ali desalination plant in Dubai is also on that list. The underlying message follows an implacable logic. If I cease to exist as a functional state, I will ensure that many of the Gulf countries accompany me in that condition. There is a fourth element that we cannot ignore, because it defines the diplomatic context in which all of this is occurring. On the very same April 22nd that Iran published these escalation rules, the government in Washington declared that there is no fixed deadline for ending the war, that the ceasefire has been extended indefinitely, and that the naval blockade continues without an end date. One day earlier, it had been announced with some fanfare that a second round of talks between Washington and Tehran would take place within the following 72 hours. That round did not take place. The White House also declared that no deadline has been set for Iran to present a peace proposal. In that, at least, there is an implicit truth that is rarely stated with the clarity it deserves. The timetables do not depend on the United States. Neither does the peace. And when a power loses its capacity to dictate the temporal terms of a negotiation, it has lost something far deeper than a tactical advantage. In March, the official narrative from Washington was that Iran had been conclusively and comprehensively destroyed militarily. It was stated without embarrassment that Iran had no operational navy, no functional air force, that its radars had been neutralized, and its missiles were obsolete and ineffective. Then a hail of missiles fell on American bases in the region, disproving each one of those assumptions. Israel was struck with hypersonic projectiles that demonstrated capabilities that did not appear in any public estimates. Aircraft were lost in Iranian airspace. One of the American aircraft carriers in the region was damaged. The narrative of total victory was disproved by the facts, as inevitably happens when rhetoric detaches itself from operational reality and honest. Analysis is replaced by whatever optimism happens to be politically convenient. Have observed this pattern before with troubling regularity. The temptation to underestimate the adversary is a permanent feature of democracies that have gone too long without confronting an opponent who forces them to take their own limitations seriously. A ground invasion, however, is an entirely different level of complexity. That is precisely why Iran is threatening to invade the Emirates and Bahrain if Washington crosses that line. Not because it is empty provocation aimed at headlines, but because it is the most disruptive and operationally credible proportional response available to it, given the current context. From the geopolitical standpoint, the logic is relentless and deserves to be articulated with precision. Iran is saying, "You invade my country, I invade 2 of yours." We are not talking about long-range missiles against continental American territory. Iran understands its own limitations with a candor that sometimes contrasts notably with the assertions coming out of Washington. What it can do, and what it has the operational capacity to execute with a high probability of success, is invade 2 small, oil-rich allies that are financially dependent on regional stability. Dubai is not merely oil. It is globally significant financial centers, premier tourist hubs, internationally valued real estate, and investments of every kind that saw in this region a business platform believed to be insulated from armed conflict. If Iran were to execute that threat, the impact would not be solely military. It would be economic on a scale that is difficult to quantify calmly. Insurance companies would raise their premiums immediately and drastically. Investors would begin moving toward safer destinations. The model of a city that lives on glamour, international business, luxury, and high-end tourism would simply collapse. We saw last month how Dubai had to close its airspace for 12 days, with all flights from Europe and Asia cancelled. A ground invasion would represent an entirely different order of magnitude, with consequences that would last for years and that would redefine the investment map across the entire region. Are speaking of an escalation within an extremely fragile truce, where the rules are no longer written in international treaties or binding agreements with verification mechanisms. They are written solely in unilateral declarations that each party interprets according to its momentary convenience. And that means, with all the gravity it implies, that the parties are not necessarily on a path toward any agreement on any near horizon. Iran has been explicit about its conditions, and the Western media has paid those conditions far less attention than they deserve. Before any direct conversation, Washington must pay economic compensation for the damage caused, unfreeze Iranian assets that have been held for decades, and indemnify the victims, not as a diplomatic concession within the framework of a negotiation, but as a precondition for even sitting at the same table. Iran is refusing to lend Washington the credibility that direct dialogue implies, because it understands with strategic coldness that any face-to-face negotiation would only give the United States time to rearm while markets calm. Oil prices fall, and the economic and political pressure on Washington gradually eases. Iran is not willing to lend itself to that game, and the rationality of that position is difficult to rebut. From any honest strategic perspective, what strikes me most, as a long-standing observer of American foreign policy and as someone who has spent decades studying how institutions respond to the crises they themselves generate, is the official silence. Regarding the threat of a ground invasion, Washington has not commented on it. The major American media barely mention it. And when they do, it is tangentially and without the analysis the situation requires. That silence is neither accidental nor innocent. There is a concrete reason for that muteness. To publicly acknowledge the threat would also mean acknowledging that there is no clear operational response to protect America's Gulf allies, that the bases in the region are not in a position to assume that defensive role effectively, and that the naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz is being sustained under conditions of growing vulnerability, especially after Russian intelligence, according to the White House's own accusations, shared with Iran the real-time coordinates of the 3 American aircraft carriers in the region. That is not speculation or armchair analysis. It is a crisis in active motion that demands our full and undivided attention. We are no longer speaking merely of a blockade at the Strait of Hormuz or of tensions in the Red Sea. We are speaking of the concrete possibility, announced by name, with specific conditions and verifiable terms, of a ground invasion knocking on the door of 2 Persian Gulf countries, with consequences that would extend far beyond the region, affecting global energy markets, international commercial routes, and the balance of power in one of the most strategically significant zones on the planet. I have spent decades watching powers confuse rhetoric with strategy and force with wisdom. What I am witnessing now in the Persian Gulf is the predictable, and in retrospect, nearly inevitable, result of a foreign policy that privileged provocation over prudence, unilateral action over the patient construction of consensus, and media theatricality over rigorous strategic planning. The consequences of those decisions are not paid by those who made them. They are paid by the most exposed allies, the most vulnerable civilians, the merchants who depend on safe trade routes, and the most fragile markets that have no capacity to absorb impacts of this magnitude. The question that hangs in the air, and that no one in Washington seems willing to answer with the honesty the situation demands, is this. Why has the White House said nothing about this threat of a ground invasion? Why is that ambiguous space left open for Iran to interpret any movement as the beginning of an assault? And why, at this moment, do there exist no functional operational bases capable of credibly protecting America's Gulf allies against a scenario that the adversary itself already announced by name? By place and by specific and verifiable conditions? Those questions deserve answers, and they deserve them not because foreign policy is an interesting academic exercise, but because lives, economic stability, and the international order that was built over decades with enormous difficulty, and which is now eroding, with a facility that ought to concern us all deeply, depend upon those answers. Leave me your thoughts in the comments. I am genuinely interested in hearing your perspective from wherever you are watching. If you are in Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, tell me what city and country you are writing from. Share this video with those you believe need to hear this analysis without filters or concessions to the official narrative. Give it a like if you believe this kind of analysis deserves to reach more people. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notifications so you do not miss the next video. I will see you in the next one.